I gifted my parents a $425,000 oceanfront mansion for their golden anniversary, but when I arrived, my mother was sobbing and my father was shaking. My sister's family had claimed it as their own. And her husband pointed at the door, shouting, "This is my house, get out." My brother-in-law was pointing at the door of a house I owned when I decided the situation had gone on long enough. Not when I pulled into the driveway and noticed the strange truck in the spot where my parents' Buick should have been. Not when I saw the moving boxes stacked against the porch railing. My porch railing on a house whose deed had my name on it in clean black ink. Not even when I walked through the front door and found my mother crying into a dish towel at the kitchen table while my father stood 3 feet away. Trembling so badly, his glasses had slid halfway down his nose. It was when Craig Dalton, 240 lb of borrowed confidence in a moisture-wicking polo shirt, turned from the window, pointed at the open front door behind me, and said with the absolute certainty of a man who has never once been seriously challenged in his life, "This is my house now. Get out." The ocean was visible through the living room window behind him. $11 million worth of coastline that I had specifically chosen because my parents deserved to wake up to something beautiful after 50 years of waking up before the sun. I closed the front door behind me, turned the deadbolt, looked at Craig. "Interesting," I said. "Tell me again whose house this is." I should back up because the story that got us to that moment started not with Craig and not entirely with my sister Vanessa, but with a Tuesday morning in March about 4 years ago when I was sitting in my car in the parking garage of a tech campus in San Jose, and I called my mother to wish her happy birthday, and she cried for 7 minutes before she told me why. My name is Ethan Whitaker. I am 38 years old. I run a software analytics company that I founded with 2 other people in a 2-bedroom apartment in 2013, and which was acquired 9 years later for a number that made me briefly famous in certain trade publications and permanently altered the shape of my life in ways I am still honestly adjusting to. I am telling you this not to establish wealth as a credential, but because it is relevant context for everything that follows. Money, I have learned, does not complicate families, it clarifies them. It takes the tensions and tendencies that were always there and removes every excuse for pretending otherwise. My parents, George and Helen Whitaker, are the kind of people who will never fully understand what I do for work and who raised me in a way that made that entirely irrelevant. My father spent 31 years as a machinist at a plant in coastal Virginia that closed in 2009. And my mother spent those same years alternating between part-time bookkeeping work and full-time management of a household that ran on careful budgeting and the specific ingenuity of people who know how to make things last. They own a 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood that peaked in the 1980s, and they have lived in it for 41 years. And they have never once complained about it in my presence because complaining was not part of the vocabulary they used in front of their children. What they also never said in front of their children or otherwise was that the house had a leaking roof they'd patched twice and couldn't afford to properly repair. That my father's knees had gotten bad enough that the stairs were a genuine daily problem. That my mother had stopped mentioning the arthritis in her hands because mentioning it had never changed anything, and she preferred not to spend her energy on things she couldn't change. I found all of this out on my mother's 68th birthday in that parking garage when she cried for 7 minutes and then apologized for crying and then told me it had just been a hard winter. I sat in that car for a long time after we hung up, then I called my real estate attorney. Vanessa Whitaker Dalton is 4 years older than me. And I want to be precise about this because precision is the only way to tell this particular story fairly. She was not always the person she became. There was a version of my sister when we were children who would share her Halloween candy without being asked, and who sat with me through 2 hours of a thunderstorm when I was 7 years old because I was afraid and she had decided without announcement to not be somewhere else. That person existed, I want to say that clearly. Somewhere in the decade of her marriage to Craig Dalton, that person had become very hard to find. Craig sold commercial insurance, or had until 8 months before the day he pointed at my door and told me to leave. He had a way of occupying space that I can only describe as presumptive. He moved through rooms as if they had been expecting him, as if his arrival was the relevant event and everything prior was simply preparation. He told long stories that were really just extended performances of his own competence. And he laughed at jokes before he'd finished telling them, which is a specific quality I find difficult to be charitable about. He and Vanessa had 2 boys, 9 and 11, who were, by all accounts, good kids. Navigating the particular challenge of being raised by people whose relationship to money was transactional and whose relationship to accountability was essentially non-existent. I did not dislike Craig because he was loud or because he laughed too much or because he had a habit of calling my parents' home the old place in a tone that managed to be simultaneously affectionate and dismissive. I disliked Craig because I had watched over 11 years the effect he had on my sister. The woman who sat with me through the thunderstorm now laughed at things that weren't funny and went quiet when she should have spoken, and had gradually, almost imperceptibly, outsourced her judgment to a man whose judgment was not worth the outsourcing. But I am getting ahead of myself. My parents found the house in April, not found. I found it with a buyer's agent named Sandra Okonkwo, who had 20 years in coastal Virginia real estate, and who understood exactly what I was looking for without requiring me to explain it twice. 3 bedrooms on the ground floor, which mattered for my father's needs. A kitchen with a south-facing window that would give my mother morning light while she cooked. A back porch that faced the water and had enough space for my father's rocking chairs and enough quiet for the both of them to sit in together without feeling they had to fill the silence. $425,000 and worth every cent of it. I put the deeds solely in my name with a formal occupancy agreement prepared by my attorney, Jonathan Marsh of Marsh Property Law. With 16 years in residential real estate and an office in the glass building on Granby Street, he established my parents as permanent occupants with clearly defined rights and protections. Jonathan had suggested this arrangement. It protects them, he told me, and it protects the property from any third-party claims. At the time, I thought he was simply being thorough. In reality, he was being prophetic. Before my parents moved in, I also had a Ring security system installed with 8 cameras covering every exterior angle and the main interior access points, all backed up to the cloud and connected to a mobile app I could access from anywhere. The installer, a young man named Devont, finished 2 hours ahead of schedule and showed me how to review the access logs. I thanked him and stored the information away, never imagining I would actually need it. My parents moved in on a Saturday in June, and I spent the weekend with them. We ate takeout crab from paper boxes on the back porch and watched the sun set over the water. My mother cried the good kind of tears this time, and my father put his arm around her, staring at the ocean with the expression of a man finally allowing himself to enjoy something he had denied himself for years. Those 2 days were the best part of my year. I drove back to Virginia Beach on Monday morning with my flight to San Jose scheduled for noon. The first sign came 2 weeks later, and I convinced myself it was nothing. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon, which was normal, but the conversation was shorter than usual. She said everything was fine. She mentioned that the garden beds along the south wall were growing nicely and that Vanessa and Craig had visited with the boys the previous Saturday. I said that sounded nice, and she agreed. But there was something strange in her voice, a kind of carefulness, as though she was speaking in a smaller space and choosing her words more cautiously than a conversation about garden beds should require. I assumed she was just tired. 3 weeks later, I called my father on a Thursday evening and got no answer. He almost always answered. His phone stayed in his shirt pocket from 7 in the morning until 9 at night with the consistency of a man who considered missed calls rude. I texted him and 3 hours passed without a response, something that had genuinely never happened before. When he finally called back at 9:47 p.m., he said he'd been outside. The words were right, but somehow arranged in the wrong order, the way people sound when they're trying to manage something while talking. I told myself he was simply adjusting to a new routine. The third sign I completely missed until I later reviewed the security footage. On a Wednesday in mid-August, Craig's truck pulled into the driveway at 11:15 a.m. He and Vanessa entered using the access code. The interior cameras, which I hadn't checked because I had installed them for my parents' safety, not for surveillance, showed them moving around the house for nearly 3 hours. One hallway camera captured Craig standing in the guest room doorway with his arms crossed, slowly turning as though he were evaluating the space for an entirely different purpose. At 2:43 p.m. they left. I didn't see any of that until later. What I did notice during a phone call in early September was that my mother's crystal wine glasses were on the wrong shelf. I knew because I had unpacked them myself and placed them on the upper left shelf, exactly where they had been for 30 years in the old house. I thought continuity would matter. My mother mentioned, almost casually, that Vanessa had reorganized the kitchen during one of her visits, but she said it with a careful tone that kitchen organization shouldn't require. "Mom, is everything okay?" I asked. "Of course," she replied. Officer Darnell Martinez arrived with Officer Yolanda Sims, and I handed them 3 things, the deed with only my name on it, the occupancy agreement my attorney Jonathan Marsh had prepared for my parents, and the ring access log showing the code had been changed 2 days earlier without my permission. Craig's confident act disappeared the moment he saw the evidence. When Officer Martinez asked my father what had happened, he quietly explained that Craig had grabbed my mother's wrist and threatened him. Officer Sims photographed the bruises while our neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Klein, came forward and confirmed several disturbing incidents she had witnessed. With the evidence and witness statements, the officers ordered Craig and Vanessa to gather their belongings and leave immediately. As they packed, the truth became obvious. Vanessa's clothes were hanging in my mother's closet, Craig's toiletries were beside my father's sink, my father's fishing rods had been thrown into a trash bag, and my mother's handmade quilts were sitting in bins marked "Donate." My mother quietly took back the blue and cream quilt she had made when she and my father were newly married. Later, my mother admitted they had slowly taken over after arriving for what was supposed to be a visit. My father found his Navy memorabilia carelessly covered with paperwork and finally told Craig, "You will never speak to my wife again." He also told Vanessa she would no longer use her mother for money or gifts. By evening, the van was loaded and they left. My attorney confirmed that my mother's injuries, documented by Officer Sims and later by Dr. Lauren Ossie, provided strong grounds for an elder abuse complaint. Months later, we learned the truth. Craig had lost his job after falsifying expense reports, Vanessa was drowning in debt, and their New Jersey home was close to foreclosure. They hadn't come for a visit, they had come for a rescue, hoping to pressure my parents into giving up the house. 6 months later, a formal complaint resulted in a 3-year no-contact order. Since then, Vanessa has never called. My parents, however, have finally settled into the life they deserved. My father spends mornings on the porch with his fishing rods safely stored away, and my mother has planted her garden and made a new quilt that hangs in the living room facing the ocean. Last Thanksgiving, my father and I sat together watching the sunrise over the water. He thanked me for knowing what they needed before they asked. I simply smiled and told him, "That's what you both always did for me."